Hey guys, there is something quietly unsettling about the medieval home that we often miss when we imagine it by firelight. We picture thick stone walls, timber beams, a glowing hearth, and perhaps the comforting smell of bread or stew. But for many people, home was also a place where the air itself could feel heavy, smoky, damp, animal-scented, and difficult to escape. Before we step inside that world, let me know where you're watching from and what history topic you'd like to hear next. If you enjoy thoughtful long-form history, a like is a simple way to support this kind of work. And if you like calm, quietly fascinating journeys into the past, subscribing will bring more of them your way. So tonight, let's enter the medieval house not through the grand castle gate, but through the low doorway of ordinary life, where warmth, shelter, smoke, breath, and survival were all part of the same enclosed room. To understand what it was like to live without fresh air in many medieval homes, we have to begin by setting aside one modern assumption: that a house is meant to be a clean separation from the outside world. For us, a good home often means controlled air. We expect windows that open and close smoothly, chimneys that draw smoke away, floors that do not hold moisture, walls that keep out rain, and ventilation that works quietly in the background. We may not think about air very much precisely because buildings now do so much thinking for us. In the Middle Ages, especially for ordinary people, the home was not a sealed machine for comfort. It was a shelter negotiated against cold, rain, wind, smoke, animals, insects, mud, and darkness. It protected people from the worst of the outside world, but it also trapped much of what daily life produced. Heat came from flame, light came from flame, cooking came from flame. Preservation, brewing, drying, mending, and sometimes small-scale craft work all brought their own smells and fumes into the domestic space. The same fire that made the house livable could also make the air painful to breathe. This is the first contradiction at the heart of the medieval home. Fresh air was desirable, but warmth was more urgent. Smoke was unpleasant, but cold could kill. A window could clear the room, but it could also invite in winter, rain, thieves, animals, and valuable heat escaping into the dark. What looks to us like bad design was often a compromise made under pressure. The poorest homes were usually simple structures, built from the materials closest at hand. In much of northern and western Europe, a rural house might be framed with timber, filled with wattle and daub, roofed with thatch, and floored with beaten earth. In some regions, stone was used, especially where timber was scarce or stone plentiful. The walls could be thick, irregular, and practical rather than elegant. The roof might sag slightly with age and weather. The floor could become damp in wet seasons, dusty in dry ones, and uneven under bare or poorly shod feet. Inside, there might be only one main room or one principal living space with small partitions. Modern privacy was not the organizing idea. People slept, ate, worked, repaired tools, stored goods, tended infants, nursed the sick, and sometimes sheltered animals under the same roof. A home could be a workshop, kitchen, bedroom, nursery, storeroom, and barn all at once. And then there was the hearth. For many medieval households, the hearth was the center of the home in a literal and emotional sense. It was where food was cooked, where people gathered for warmth, where small tasks could be done in dim light, and where the day's labor gradually gave way to evening. But in many early and poorer medieval houses, the hearth was not connected to a modern-style chimney. Instead, the smoke rose from an open fire and found its way out as best it could, through a hole in the roof, through gaps in thatch, through doorways, through cracks, or through small smoke vents. The result was not the gentle, romantic smoke of a painted cottage scene. It was a persistent presence in the upper air of the room, clung to rafters, darkened beams, seasoned roof timbers with soot, found wool, hair, skin, food, bedding, and clothing. On still days, or when the draw was poor, smoke could hang low enough to sting the eyes and catch in the throat. Children grew up under it. Older people slept near it. Women, who often spent long hours around cooking fires, could be especially exposed to it. The very architecture of survival made breathing a daily negotiation. This does not mean every medieval person walked around constantly choking in the same way, or that every house was identical. Conditions varied enormously by region, wealth, climate, and period. Some urban houses had better chimney arrangements. Wealthier households could afford larger spaces, more specialized rooms, and improvements that separated smoke, animals, and waste from the principal living areas. Monasteries, manor houses, castles, and prosperous townhomes could be far more complex than a peasant cottage. Yet even there, the medieval understanding of indoor air was shaped by different limits and expectations. For ordinary households, the lack of fresh air was not always seen as a single problem to be solved. It was folded into the larger problem of keeping life going. Smoke helped preserve meat hanging above the fire. It discouraged some insects. It dried rafters and thatch. It blackened and hardened surfaces in ways that were not purely accidental. In some homes, a smoky interior was part nuisance, part tool, part unavoidable consequence of warmth. This is one of those details where modern judgment can move too quickly. What seems simply unhealthy from our point of view could also be connected to functions that mattered deeply at the time. Still, the physical reality was real. Imagine waking before dawn in a small house after a cold night. The fire has burned low, perhaps reduced to embers under ash. The room smells of damp earth, old smoke, wool, sweat, rushes, wood, and animals. If livestock are nearby or sharing part of the building, there may be the sour-sweet warmth of bodies and manure. A baby stirs. Someone coughs. The air is not empty or neutral. It has weight. A person rises carefully because the room is dark. There is no switch, no clean sudden light. If the fire must be revived, smoke may thicken before the flames settle. Damp fuel can make matters worse. Wood was not always perfectly seasoned, and in places where wood became scarce or expensive, people used peat, turf, straw, brushwood, dung, or other combustible materials. Each fuel burned differently. Each had its own smell. Each produced its own kind of smoke. A medieval household's air was shaped not just by architecture, but by the local landscape and economy. This is where the story grows larger than the house. Air inside the home depended on forests, fields, rights of access, weather, labor, and poverty. A family with reliable dry firewood could experience the hearth differently from a family forced to burn damp twigs or smoky turf. A well-built chimney required money, skill, and materials. A larger room required resources. Even the ability to leave a door open depended on the season, safety, and the layout of the settlement. Fresh air was not merely a preference. It was a privilege shaped by structure. The word medieval covers roughly 1,000 years, and it is important not to flatten that long span into one image. In the earlier Middle Ages, many houses in Northern Europe used central hearths with smoke escaping through the roof. Over time, chimneys became more common, especially in towns and among wealthier households. But this change was uneven. A castle might have fireplaces and flues while a poor rural household still lived with smoke curling above an open hearth. Even within the same century, the experience of air could differ sharply between a prosperous merchant's home and a tenant farmer's cottage. And yet the problem of indoor air remained stubborn because medieval domestic life produced so many things that modern homes remove or isolate. Cooking smells were not confined to a ventilated kitchen. Bodies were not washed with the regularity or privacy many people now expect, though medieval people were not as indifferent to cleanliness as old stereotypes suggest. Clothing absorbed smoke and sweat. Bedding could become musty. Floors were often covered with rushes or straw, sometimes refreshed, sometimes allowed to accumulate dirt, crumbs, insects, and small debris. Waste management varied, and in dense urban areas it could become especially unpleasant. In towns, the air inside a house had to contend with the air outside it. Medieval streets could be crowded, narrow, and busy with animals, carts, workshops, refuse, cooking, brewing, tanning, dyeing, butchering, and market trade. A window opened for freshness might admit the smells of the street. Dung, smoke, rotting vegetables, wet leather, fish, ale, human waste, and mud. This is another expectation reversal. Fresh air was not always fresh in the modern sense. The outdoors itself could be smoky, foul, or stagnant, especially in crowded urban quarters. So a medieval household might choose between stale indoor smoke and unpleasant outdoor odors. The distinction between inside and outside was not a simple one. Houses breathed through their cracks, roofs, shutters, doors, and imperfections. They were leaky in some ways and suffocating in others. They admitted cold drafts while still trapping smoke. They let in damp while still holding bad smells. A building could be both porous and poorly ventilated at the same time. The medieval window reveals this contradiction beautifully. For many ordinary homes, windows were small because glass was expensive and heat loss mattered. Some openings had shutters, cloth, horn, oiled parchment, lattice, or nothing at all. A small window gave light and air, but not much of either. A larger opening could be a liability. In winter, it would make the room colder. At night, it could feel unsafe. In rainy weather, it could let in water. In a smoky house, opening a shutter might help for a while, but it was not the same as living in a home designed around cross-ventilation. The body adapted as bodies do. Medieval people were familiar with smells that might overwhelm us. They had different thresholds for discomfort, different expectations of privacy, and different ideas about what a normal room should feel like. But adaptation is not the same as immunity. Smoke irritates eyes and lungs whether or not a person has language for modern respiratory medicine. Dampness chills the body whether or not one speaks of mold spores. Crowding spreads infection whether or not one understands germs. The medieval home could be emotionally protective and physically harsh at the same time. This is one of the quiet truths of domestic history. The home was often both refuge and risk. A house gave people a place to sleep, eat, repair tools, store food, and survive the weather. It anchored family memory. It held the fire, and the fire held the household together. But the same enclosed space could magnify illness, smoke exposure, parasites, and fatigue. If one person coughed through the night, others heard it from a few feet away. If smoke failed to rise, everyone shared it. If damp crept into bedding, there was no easy modern remedy. If the roof leaked, the room became colder and the floor more miserable. The house protected life, but it did not necessarily make life comfortable. For a sleep-friendly history channel, it is tempting to make the medieval interior gentle, all candles and quiet rain. And there were surely gentle moments. The soft sound of work by firelight, the murmur of a family settling in, the smell of bread, the warmth of animals nearby. This matters because when we ask what it was like to live without fresh air, we are also asking who had the power to escape bad air. In many medieval settings, rank decided distance from discomfort. Even within one household, the best air belonged to the best rooms. Yet we should also avoid imagining medieval people as passive victims of their homes. They made choices within limits. They opened doors when they could. They designed roof vents. They placed hearths with practical knowledge gained over generations. They used shutters, partitions, raised sleeping areas, lofts, wall hangings, rushes, and seasonal routines. They understood that smoke moved, that damp mattered, that drafts could be dangerous, that stale smells signaled trouble. Their explanations differed from ours, but their observations were not foolish. Medieval medical thought often interpreted air through ideas of miasma, balance, corruption, and bodily humors. Bad smells were taken seriously, even if the underlying mechanisms were misunderstood. People believed that foul air could harm the body, and in some practical ways that belief could encourage attempts to avoid rot, stink, and stagnation. The modern germ theory of disease was absent, but the suspicion that bad air and sickness were connected had deep roots. A foul-smelling room was not simply accepted as harmless. Here the medieval world becomes more complex than the caricature. People did not need modern science to know that some air felt bad. They could feel smoke sting. They could smell decay. They could observe sickness spreading in crowded places. They might explain these things differently, but they were not living in total ignorance. The gap between their world and ours is not that they loved filth and smoke. It is that their tools for changing those conditions were limited, expensive, uneven, and shaped by survival needs. In some ways, the medieval home trained the senses differently. Smell carried information. Smoke might tell you what fuel was burning, whether food was cooking, whether a neighbor's hearth had been lit, whether a roof was in danger, whether animals were ill-kept, whether food was spoiling, whether sickness or death had entered a house. The nose was part of domestic intelligence. Fresh air was not abstract. It was felt as relief, as safety, as change. A person stepping out from a smoky room into cold morning air might experience something intensely physical. The clearing of the throat, the sharpness of frost, the smell of wet fields or town mud, the sudden space above the head. But that outdoor freshness could be brief. Work waited. Weather pressed in. The house had to be re-entered. The fire had to be tended again. And so the medieval home was not merely a place with bad ventilation. It was a system of trade-offs. Heat against breath. Safety against openness. Animals against cleanliness. Fuel against smoke. Poverty against comfort. Tradition against innovation. Every beam, shutter, hearth, and roof vent belonged to a world where survival came before ease. The deeper we go into that world, the less useful it becomes to laugh at it. The better question is not, why did they live like that? The better question is, what choices did they actually have? Once we ask that, the smoky medieval house becomes less like a strange failure and more like a human answer to a difficult environment. And inside that answer, ordinary life continued. Children learned to crawl on floors that were hard and cold. Women bent over pots in firelight. Men came in from fields or workshops carrying the smell of labor with them. Older relatives sat close to warmth because their bodies needed it. Servants slept where space allowed. Animals shifted beyond a partition. Rain tapped the roof. Smoke moved slowly upward, sometimes obediently, sometimes not. To modern ears, this can sound harsh. But for the people inside, it was home. Not because it was comfortable in the way we define comfort, but because it held the fragile arrangement of their world. The fire marked belonging. The walls marked protection. The smoky rafters marked years of meals, winters, repairs, births, illnesses, and ordinary evenings. And as medieval towns grew, as populations shifted, as trade expanded, and as houses began to rise more tightly along streets and lanes, the question of air would become even more complicated, because the problem was no longer only how smoke escaped from one hearth, but how entire communities breathed when homes, workshops, animals, ovens, waste, and human bodies were packed closer together than ever before. When homes, workshops, animals, ovens, waste, and human bodies were packed closer together than ever before, The medieval problem of air began to move beyond the private household and into the life of the street. A cottage standing alone in a village had its own smoky hardships, but a townhouse pressed between neighbors shared the breath of a much larger organism. The walls were closer, the alleys were narrower, the work was more concentrated, and the air that entered through a shutter or doorway might already have passed over a butcher's stall, a dung heap, a tannery yard, a brewer's fire, a bakery oven, and a line of horses waiting in the mud. This is where medieval domestic air becomes urban air. In a growing town, the house no longer existed as a simple shelter against weather. It became part of a dense chain of smells, smoke, heat, labor, and refuse. Every building produced something. Every trade left a trace. A baker's oven gave warmth and the smell of bread, but also smoke, ash, and heat. A blacksmith's forge sent sparks and fumes into the lane. A dyer's workshop might release sharp odors from vats. A tanner's yard was notoriously unpleasant, because turning hides into leather required substances and processes that modern people would almost instinctively keep far from living rooms. But in medieval towns, work and home often lived side by side, sometimes in the very same building. The house of a craft worker might have a shop at the front, a working area below, and family space behind or above. The street-facing window or open stall was not just a source of light and air. It was part of the business. Customers approached. Goods were displayed. Tools were used. Apprentices worked. Smoke, dust, wool fibers, metal filings, leather scraps, flour, fish scales, spilled ale, and damp rushes could all become part of the atmosphere of everyday life. The boundary between earning a living and breathing at home was thin. And yet, to the people of the time, this arrangement was not chaos. It was how a town functioned. Medieval urban life depended on proximity. People needed to live near their trade, near the market, near water, near customers, near guild connections, near parish church and city gate. A wider, cleaner, better ventilated layout may have been desirable in theory, but land inside town walls or established streets was valuable. Walls, ditches, legal boundaries, and simple convenience pushed buildings together. In many places, houses grew upward or backward because there was little easy room to spread outward. That pressure changed the air. Upper floors might overhang the street, narrowing the space above the lane and reducing light below. Neighbors could be close enough to hear each other through timber walls. Smoke from one chimney might drift into another house if wind and roof lines worked against it. Waste thrown or carried into the street could linger, especially where drainage was poor. Rain might wash refuse downhill, but it could also turn everything into a wet mixture of mud, dung, straw, ashes, and household waste. In dry weather, dust rose. In wet weather, odors deepened. A modern person might ask why people did not simply clean it all up. But medieval towns did try, in their own ways, to control waste, smell, fire, and obstruction. Many towns had regulations about where certain trades could operate, how streets should be cleared, how animals should be managed, how waste should be removed, and how dangerous fires should be handled. The difficulty was not that no one cared. The difficulty was enforcement, capacity, technology, poverty, and the sheer daily volume of urban life. A town was a living engine without modern plumbing, without motorized collection, without industrial ventilation, and without a clean separation between residential, commercial, and agricultural worlds. The medieval town was never still. It breathed in smoke and exhaled labor. In the morning, fires were lit across the settlement. Hearth smoke rose from houses. Ovens were kindled. Workshops opened. Animals moved through lanes. Carts creaked over rough ground. People carried water, fuel, food, cloth, hides, baskets, tools, and waste. The air changed hour by hour. A narrow street might smell of baking at one moment, wet wool at another, then horse dung, then wood smoke, then fish, then the heavy odor of a nearby drain. The medieval nose lived in a layered world. This matters because a town dweller could not always escape bad indoor air by stepping outside. The outside might be just as charged, only in a different way. A household could open shutters to clear hearth smoke and receive instead the smoke of the street. They could let in light and also let in flies. They could open a door for air and invite noise, cold, dust, thieves' eyes, or the smell of refuse. Ventilation was not a simple blessing. It was a bargain with the surroundings. In crowded urban houses, privacy and air competed for the same openings. Shutters could protect the household from weather and intrusion, but they also reduced airflow. Cloth or parchment coverings might soften the cold, but they also dimmed the room. Glass windows, where available, were precious and often associated with wealth, churches, or higher-status domestic spaces. Even when glass existed in a home, it was not necessarily arranged for constant fresh air in the modern sense. A window was light, status, protection, and temperature control before it was an instrument of ventilation. The upper chambers of a townhouse could feel different from the rooms below. They might be somewhat removed from street smells, though not always from smoke. Heat rose, smells rose, voices rose. A room above a workshop might be warmer but also thick with the traces of whatever work was being done below. In winter, that warmth could be welcome. In summer, it could become oppressive. The same building might offer relief in one season and discomfort in another. And inside these houses, human density mattered. Medieval families could be extended, fluid, and economically intertwined. A home might include parents, children, servants, apprentices, lodgers, relatives, or workers attached to a household enterprise. Beds could be shared. Sleeping spaces were often communal. In many settings, people did not expect each person to have a separate room or even a separate bed. Warmth, economy, and space encouraged closeness. But closeness also meant shared breath, shared illness, shared smells, and shared discomfort. This is one of the more intimate parts of the history of air. We often speak of medieval towns in terms of walls, markets, guilds, and churches, but the night air of a household tells a different story. After the workday, when fires settled and shutters closed, the room did not become empty. It filled with sleeping bodies. The smell of old blankets, linen, old straw, smoke-darkened beams, damp shoes, stored food, and tired people gathered slowly in the darkness. If someone was ill, the household shared the sound and nearness of it. If an infant cried, everyone heard. If the air was stale, there was little escape. Still, there was comfort in proximity as well. Modern isolation was not the medieval ideal. To sleep near others could mean safety, warmth, and belonging. Shared rooms were not only a sign of hardship. They were part of a world in which the household was the basic unit of survival. The discomfort was real, but so was the security. A person alone in a cold chamber might have had more air, but not necessarily a better night. The medieval understanding of comfort was therefore not identical to ours. Comfort was warmth when the weather turned bitter. Comfort was a roof that did not fail. Comfort was dry enough bedding. Comfort was enough fuel to keep embers alive until morning. Comfort was food stored safely, animals protected, children nearby, and the door secured. Fresh air mattered, but it stood among many needs, and not always first. This makes the history more human and less simple. It is easy to imagine medieval people as either filthy and unaware, or as rustic figures happily at peace with smoke and smell. Neither image is fair. They were neither modern hygienists nor careless caricatures. They were people managing their environments with the knowledge, materials, money, customs, and constraints available to them. They complained, adapted, regulated, endured, improved, and compromised. One of the most revealing compromises involved the placement of the kitchen. In wealthy households, especially larger manor houses, monasteries, and castles, kitchens were often separated from elite living spaces because they were hot, smoky, busy, and dangerous. Cooking for many people required large fires, great pots, roasting equipment, ovens, storage, servants, and constant movement. A great kitchen could be a remarkable place of skill and labor, but not a pleasant place to breathe for long hours. The separation of the kitchen from the hall or chamber was partly about status, partly about fire safety, and partly about the obvious reality that cooking air was harsh air. In poorer homes, that separation was usually impossible. The family lived with its cooking. The hearth was not hidden behind service corridors. The smells of food preparation were the smells of home. A pot of pottage simmering over a smoky fire could nourish the body while filling the room with steam and soot. A loaf baked in a communal oven might avoid some household smoke, but the trip to the oven, the use of shared facilities, and the timing of baking all belonged to the rhythms of the community. Even the way bread entered the home was part of a larger network of fire and air. Communal ovens themselves remind us that medieval people often shared infrastructure because private solutions were costly. A village or town might rely on a bakehouse, mill, well, fountain, or washing place. These shared spaces concentrated activity, and with activity came smell, smoke, moisture, and social contact. Fresh air was not simply found in nature. It was negotiated through community arrangements. Water shaped the indoor atmosphere too. Without modern plumbing, water had to be carried, stored, heated, used, and disposed of. Wet clothing dried indoors when weather forced it. Floors tracked in mud. Roof leaks introduced damp. Cellars and storage areas could become musty. In many medieval climates, especially in parts of northern Europe, damp was as important as smoke in shaping domestic discomfort. A house could smell not only of fire, but of wet earth and old wood. Dampness also affected fuel. If wood was stored poorly or gathered wet, it burned with more smoke. If peat or turf was used, the smell could be distinctive and persistent. If a household lacked enough fuel, they might burn whatever was available, even if it smoked badly. Fuel poverty is an old problem. It is easy to forget that warmth has always had an economy. Clean warmth required resources. Dirty warmth was often better than no warmth at all. That phrase, dirty warmth, sits close to the heart of medieval domestic life. The fire warmed, cooked, dried, lit, protected, and gathered people together. But it also irritated lungs, blackened walls, consumed fuel, and threatened catastrophe. The same thing that made a home survivable also made its air worse. This is not just a medieval paradox. It is a recurring human one. Many societies have lived with harmful indoor smoke because the alternative was cold, hunger, or darkness. In the medieval period, however, the open hearth had a social meaning that went beyond utility. The hearth symbolized household continuity. To keep a fire was to maintain a domestic center. In some traditions, the fire itself carried emotional and legal weight, tied to residence, family, and belonging. The smoke rising from a house signaled that it was inhabited. A dead hearth could mean absence, poverty, or misfortune. In a village landscape, smoke from roofs marked human presence. From outside, smoke could look peaceful. From inside, it could sting the eyes. This double meaning gives the medieval home its strange depth. What appears beautiful from a distance may have been difficult up close. A cluster of thatched houses with smoke rising into evening air can look almost idyllic. But inside, the smoke did not simply vanish into the sky. It passed through the lives of those who made it. Clothing carried that story outward. Wool, linen, leather, and fur absorbed smells. A person who spent the day in a smoky house or workshop carried that atmosphere into church, market, field, or bed. There was no sharp division between the smell of the home and the smell of the person. Medieval clothing was cleaned, aired, brushed, mended, and managed, but laundering was laborious, and not every fabric could be washed easily. Smoke could become almost a layer of ordinary identity. The same was true of hair and skin. Bathing practices varied by region, period, class, and circumstance, and the old notion that medieval Europeans never bathed is too crude. Public bathhouses existed in some towns. Washing hands and faces mattered. Clean linen was valued. But regular full-body bathing in private heated rooms was not a simple everyday routine for most people. Heating water required fuel and labor. Privacy was limited. Seasonal cold made washing harder. So the body, like the house, carried traces of smoke, work, sweat, damp, and environment. This does not mean medieval people were indifferent to pleasant smells. They valued herbs, flowers, clean rushes, incense, scented waters, and fresh linens where available. Churches used incense in ritual settings, shaping sacred air as something distinct from ordinary air. Wealthier households might strew floors with rushes and fragrant herbs, partly for practical and sensory reasons. Gardens, orchards, and fields offered cleaner smells than streets and workshops. The desire for better air was present. The ability to secure it was unequal. Medieval religious life also gives us another way to understand air. Churches were not always fresh in the modern sense, especially when crowded, cold, candlelit, and filled with bodies. But they were often experienced as different from domestic interiors. The height of a church nave, the coolness of stone, the scent of incense, wax, and damp masonry, the filtered light, the echoing space above the head. All of this could create a powerful sensory contrast with the low, smoky rooms of daily life. Air itself could feel morally and emotionally charged. The high space of worship lifted smoke, sound, and thought upward. For poorer people, entering a larger church might have been one of the few regular experiences of architectural spaciousness. The home was low and close. The church was high and echoing. The house held smoke near the rafters. The church drew the eyes upward into shadow and light. This contrast did not remove domestic hardship, but it shaped imagination. Medieval people understood space through the body. They knew the difference between close air and high air. In castles and monasteries, too, architecture could create different atmospheres. A monastery might have a refectory, dormitory, kitchen, infirmary, cloister, chapter house, and church, each with different air, sound, and use. The cloister offered an open-air passage protected from rain, a kind of controlled breathing space between enclosed rooms. The infirmary, where available, might be placed with some concern for quiet, light, and air, though always within the medical ideas of the time. Monastic rules often cared about order, cleanliness, and discipline in ways that affected the environment of daily life. But the ordinary home did not have such division. Its genius, if we can call it that, was compression. Many needs were folded into little space. A stool, a chest, a sleeping pallet, a pot, a hook, a bench, a ladder, a shelf, a loom, a cradle, a barrel, a bundle of tools, a pile of fuel, a hanging joint of meat, a sleeping dog, a child's wooden toy, and a smoky hearth might all belong to one living arrangement. Air had to move around all of it or fail to. The more we imagine these interiors carefully, the more we see that the absence of fresh air was not one condition. It was a collection of overlapping conditions. Smoke, damp, crowding, odors, disease, poor drainage, limited windows, fuel quality, animals, work processes, and seasonal enclosure. A medieval house could be breathable in one moment and oppressive in another. It could be tolerable in summer and punishing in winter. It could be better after a roof repair, worse after a wet harvest, cleaner after fresh rushes, fouler after illness, more smoky when the fuel was damp, more airy when the door stood open. This changing quality made domestic comfort fragile. It depended on daily labor. Someone had to tend the fire, clear ashes, manage bedding, sweep or renew floor coverings, carry out waste, bring in fuel, dry clothing, watch animals, repair leaks, and open or close shutters according to weather. Much of this labor was repetitive and easily overlooked because it did not produce a grand historical event. Yet it shaped the air people breathed more than the decisions of kings. Women's labor, in particular, often stood between the household and worsening discomfort. Cooking, cleaning, childcare, textile work, brewing, dairying, tending small animals, managing bedding and clothing. All of these could shape the indoor environment. The home's air was not simply given by architecture. It was maintained by hands. But those same hands were exposed to the smoke, steam, damp, and fatigue of the work. The caretaker of the home often bore much of the home's discomfort. This is one reason a calm history of medieval air must also be a history of ordinary endurance. Not dramatic suffering every moment, not misery as spectacle, but a steady background of physical demands. Eyes watering near a hearth. A cough that worsens in winter, damp sleeves drying slowly, a child kept near warmth but away from sparks, an old person choosing smoke over cold, a servant waking before others to stir the fire. These small scenes are not decorations. They are the texture of survival. The expectation reversal here is important. We often imagine discomfort as a sign that something has gone wrong. For medieval people, many discomforts were part of things going right enough. Smoke meant there was fire. Animal smell meant valuable livestock were alive and protected. Crowding meant the household was intact. Steam meant food was cooking or laundry was being done. Damp wool meant someone had clothing to dry. The same signs that trouble a modern observer could indicate continuity, work, and survival. But there were limits. When air turned too foul, when disease entered, when smoke became intolerable, when waste accumulated, when damp rotted timber or bedding, people responded as they could. They aired things. They moved work outside. They burned herbs or used scent. They cleaned, rebuilt, repaired, complained, petitioned town authorities, or followed local rules. They did not possess modern ventilation science, but they were not without practical judgment. Urban authorities sometimes tried to move noxious trades away from central areas or waterways, though success varied. Butchers, tanners, fullers, dyers, and others could become targets of regulation because their work affected neighbors. The problem was that these trades were necessary. Towns needed leather, cloth, meat, metalwork, beer, bread, and candles. A clean town without dirty trades was not possible under medieval conditions. So the question became not whether unpleasant air could be eliminated, but where it would be concentrated, who would endure it, and how much was considered acceptable. This again links air to power. Those with influence could sometimes push bad smells away. The poor, the marginal, and the laboring classes often lived closer to the processes that wealthier people preferred not to breathe. In this sense, medieval air was socially organized. It followed money, land, privilege, and necessity. Even within the same town, one street might smell of spice and cloth, another of hides and waste, another of fish, another of smoke from ovens and forges. Air became a map of occupation. To walk through the town was to move through invisible districts of labor. The nose could read the economy, and somewhere above those streets, behind shutters or beneath thatch, families continued to make homes within the limits of their world. They learned when to open a door and when to keep it shut. They learned how wind behaved at certain corners. They knew which fuel smoked badly, which neighbor's trade fouled the lane, which season brought the worst damp, which room held heat longest, which corner was safest for storage, which beam dripped in rain, and which hour of the day gave the cleanest air. That knowledge was local, practical, and rarely written down. It lived in habit. It passed from mother to daughter, master to apprentice, servant to newcomer, neighbor to neighbor. Medieval domestic intelligence was not always recorded in chronicles, but it governed life. A person could be illiterate and still understand the movement of smoke in a room better than a distant scholar. They could not explain airflow in modern terms, but they knew where not to sit when the wind turned. And as the centuries passed, these practical pressures helped reshape buildings slowly. More chimneys appeared. More houses developed upper floors and specialized rooms. Urban building regulations evolved. Materials changed. Expectations shifted. Comfort became something people pursued not only through warmth, but through separation. Separating cooking from sleeping, animals from family, waste from street, work from chamber, smoke from breath. Yet this transition was gradual and uneven. Many people lived for generations in houses where old patterns remained. A chimney might appear in one room but not another. A town might regulate waste but fail to keep streets clean. A wealthy merchant might install glazed windows while poorer neighbors relied on shutters. Improvement did not arrive as a single invention sweeping across Europe. It moved slowly, through money, fashion, law, craft knowledge, and necessity. The story of medieval fresh air, then, is not just a story of what people lacked. It is a story of what they were beginning, slowly and imperfectly, to change. The desire to direct smoke, separate functions, manage waste, and make rooms more livable was already present. The medieval home was not frozen in primitive darkness. It was evolving, but at the pace of wood, stone, coin, custom, and climate. And just as important, the medieval house was changing because society itself was changing. Towns were growing. Trade was widening. Skilled crafts were becoming more specialized. Wealth was becoming more visible in domestic architecture. The Black Death, later in the period, would transform labor relations, settlement patterns, and in some places the availability of space and resources. But even before that great rupture, the pressure of population and economy had already made air a more crowded problem. To stand in a medieval town at dusk is to feel that pressure gathering. The day's work begins to close. Smoke rises from many roofs at once. Doors narrow to cracks of light. Animals are led in or tied nearby. Apprentices put away tools. A woman shakes out a cloth, then pulls the shutter against the cold. Somewhere a bell sounds. Somewhere a cart will sinks into mud. The smell of supper mixes with the smell of the street. Inside each house, the air thickens for the night. And in that thickening air, another question waits. How did people sleep, breathe, dream, and recover in rooms where darkness, smoke, damp, and human closeness all gathered around the bed? That question takes us deeper still, away from the public street and back into the most private hours of medieval life, when the fire burned low, the shutters held, and the household breathed together in the long medieval night. The household did not simply sleep inside the house. It became part of the house's breathing. Every body added warmth, moisture, sound, and scent to the room. Every blanket held the day's smoke. Every wall kept out a little of the weather while holding in a little more of the life within. And as the fire sank lower, the balance inside the room changed again, because the thing that had filled the house with smoke had also been the thing that kept cold and damp from taking possession of it. Night made the medieval home more enclosed. In daylight, a door could stand open, work could spill outside, and the house could breathe through movement. People came and went. Children ran between interior and yard. Fuel was brought in. Water was carried. Food was prepared. Animals were tended. Shutters might open to admit light, and smoke could drift toward a roof vent or out through gaps under the eaves. But after dark, especially in cold or dangerous seasons, the household drew inward. Doors were barred. Shutters were pulled. The fire was banked. The outside world became less a source of air than a source of uncertainty. This is one of the quiet reversals in medieval domestic life. The house was often at its safest when it was least fresh. A closed door protected the sleeping household from cold, stray animals, thieves, and sudden intrusion. A shutter kept out rain and wind. A low fire reduced the danger of sparks while preserving embers for morning. But these same prudent choices reduced circulation. The air became still. The smells of the day settled into corners. Breath gathered beneath rafters. Damp clothing, if brought inside, slowly gave up its moisture into the room. A sick person's coughing filled the same enclosed space where others tried to rest. Sleep, then, was not the clean private escape that many modern people imagine. It was social, seasonal, and physical. In poorer homes, sleeping arrangements could be crowded and flexible. Children might sleep near parents, servants near the hearth, apprentices in shop spaces, animals nearby or beneath the same roof. Bedding might be a mattress or sack stuffed with straw, wool, feathers for those with means, or simpler arrangements for the poor. Blankets and cloaks did more than provide comfort. They were defenses against cold air, hard surfaces, and the slow seep of damp from floors and walls. The bed itself, where one existed as a substantial piece of furniture, was often among the most valued possessions in a household. In wealthier homes, a bed could be large, curtained, raised, layered with textiles, and treated as a sign of status. Bed curtains are sometimes imagined as purely decorative, but they served practical purposes. They trapped warmth. They gave privacy. They softened drafts. They helped create a smaller enclosure within a cold room. Yet the same curtains that made sleep warmer could also make the air around the sleeper more stagnant. Comfort again came through enclosure. For the poor, the problem was sharper. Without ample bedding or curtained beds, they relied on closeness, clothing, straw, and fire. Sleeping near others preserved heat. Sleeping near the hearth helped against cold but increased exposure to smoke and ash. Sleeping farther away might mean cleaner air but a harder chill. There was no perfect place. A medieval family arranged itself according to need. The old, the sick, the very young, and the tired might all compete silently for the least bad warmth. The night air could be especially hard in winter. Cold makes smoke behave differently, and poorly drawing fires can send it low into the room. Damp fuel smolders. Wind at the wrong angle can push smoke back through vents or down a chimney. A fire banked under ash might send a thin, persistent smell through the sleeping space. To keep a flame too active was dangerous and costly. To let it die completely meant a colder morning and the labor of rekindling. The hearth had to be managed with care, because the household's morning began the night before. There was also a practical intelligence in banking a fire. Embers preserved under ash could be coaxed back to life at dawn. In a world without matches, this mattered. Fire was not difficult only because fuel had to be gathered or bought. It also required continuity. Losing the fire could mean borrowing flame from a neighbor, using flint and steel, or spending precious time in the cold. So the household accepted the presence of a low, smoky, sleeping fire as part of domestic order. It was not merely a convenience. It was a thread connecting one day to the next. Imagine the room after midnight. The loud work of the day has fallen away. The ceiling beams are blackened from years of smoke. The thatch above may hold the scent of seasons. Somewhere near the hearth, ashes shift faintly. A child breathes heavily under a cover. A dog turns in sleep. From an attached byre, an animal moves against wood or stone. The air is warmer close to the ground near the fire and colder near the walls, or sometimes the opposite as smoke and heat gather above. The room is not silent. It creaks, exhales, drips, scratches, and settles. For people accustomed to this world, such sounds and smells could be ordinary. But ordinary does not mean easy. A night in a smoky or damp room affected rest. Eyes irritated by smoke during the day might still sting at night. A cough could worsen when lying down. Damp bedding could make sleep shallow. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, and other pests added another layer of discomfort. The medieval bed was a place of rest, but also a place where the body remained exposed to the environment. Parasites are an uncomfortable subject, but they are part of the history of air because they remind us that the medieval domestic interior was a biological space. Straw bedding, textiles, animals, humans, and stored food all attracted living things. Cleaning and airing bedding helped, but resources varied. In some households, bedding might be taken outside when weather allowed, shaken, aired, or refreshed. Rushes or straw could be replaced. Herbs might be used for scent or deterrence. But the home was not sterile. It was shared with small, persistent life. This is where the modern idea of fresh air becomes too narrow if we mean only oxygen or ventilation. Freshness in the medieval sense could involve dryness, sweetness of smell, freedom from rot, absence of pests, and relief from crowding. A room might technically have drafts and still feel foul. Another might be enclosed but orderly, dry, and carefully maintained. People judged air through experience. How it smelled, how it felt in the throat, whether it seemed to carry sickness, whether it was cold enough to harm, whether dampness clung to cloth, whether smoke made the eyes water. In medical writing and common belief, air mattered deeply. Medieval people inherited ancient ideas about the qualities of air: hot, cold, dry, moist, corrupt, wholesome, dangerous. The exact theories could be complex, tied to humoral medicine, astrology, geography, and season. But at a practical level, many believed that foul or corrupted air could harm the body. During outbreaks of disease, attention to air intensified. People might burn aromatic substances, avoid stench, seek cleaner surroundings, or fear enclosed and corrupted spaces. The reasoning was not modern, but the concern was real. The household night, therefore, had a medical dimension. A sleeping room was not just a private area. It was a place where the body's balance could be influenced by temperature, damp, smell, and closeness. Too much cold might weaken. Too much damp might be feared. Bad smells could be alarming. Night air itself was sometimes treated with suspicion, especially if it was cold, misty, or associated with marshes and disease. Opening a window at night was not automatically considered healthy. What modern people might see as ventilation, medieval people might see as exposure. This is an important point. When we ask why people did not simply let in more air, we are often assuming that outside air was always understood as good. But medieval attitudes were more conditional. Fresh country air might be praised. Foul town air might be feared. Cold night air could be risky. Damp air could be dangerous. Air from marshy ground, rotting matter, or plague-struck neighborhoods could be imagined as corrupt. The question was not open or closed, but what kind of air, at what hour, in what season, entering whose body. The sleeping body was thought to be vulnerable. In sleep, one was less guarded, less active, less able to regulate contact with the world. Coverings, curtains, shutters, and enclosed beds made sense not only for warmth and privacy, but for protection from drafts, insects, and perceived harmful influences. The modern desire for a cool, well-ventilated bedroom would not translate neatly into every medieval setting. Comfort and health were interpreted through different balances. And yet, practice could be pragmatic. If a room was too smoky, people opened what they could. If a bed was damp, they dried it. If bad smells collected, they tried to clear them. If summer heat made enclosure unbearable, sleeping arrangements shifted. People slept outdoors in some circumstances, in barns, lofts, or temporary places during labor seasons, especially when work demanded it. The medieval home was not a rigid box. It changed with weather, harvest, illness, and necessity. Among the wealthy, the night could be managed with more layers of control. A chamber might be separate from the main hall. A fireplace might warm it. Tapestries and wall hangings could reduce drafts and soften cold walls. Bed curtains could create a warm pocket. Servants could prepare the room, tend the fire, bring warming pans, adjust coverings, and manage candles or lamps. But even elite sleep was not modern sleep. Stone chambers could be cold. Fireplaces could smoke. Rushlights and candles smelled. Privies could be unpleasant. Bedding still required constant care. The rich could improve air, but not perfect it. The difference lay in distance and service. The wealthy could distance themselves from the smokiest labor. Their kitchens were elsewhere. Their animals were elsewhere. Their waste might be handled by servants. Their bedchambers could be aired and arranged by others. They had more textiles to absorb drafts, more fuel for warmth, more space to avoid crowding. In the history of breathing, comfort often means someone else has taken on the discomfort before it reaches you. In poorer homes, the night compressed everything. The smells of labor did not vanish at the threshold of a private chamber. They settled into the same space where the family slept. If the day involved brewing, washing, cooking, repairing, or tending animals, the residue of that work remained. In winter, when ventilation was reduced, the household breathed the history of its own day. There is something deeply intimate in that. The medieval home remembered. It remembered meals in the soot above the hearth. It remembered wet boots in the floor. It remembered smoke in wool. It remembered sickness in bedding. It remembered childbirth, fever, old age, and exhaustion in the same few square yards. The air of the house was not neutral. It was a kind of invisible archive. Childbirth, in particular, reveals how enclosed and atmospheric the medieval home could be. Many births occurred within domestic spaces, surrounded by women, textiles, warmth, and ritual. The birthing room or area might be kept warm, sometimes deliberately enclosed, with windows shuttered and light controlled according to custom and belief. Warmth was protective. Privacy mattered. The air might be thick with body heat, smoke, sweat, herbs, candle or lamp fumes, and anxious breath. For modern viewers, that lack of fresh air may seem alarming. For those present, exposure to cold drafts could appear more dangerous than closeness. The same tension appeared in illness. A sick person might be kept warm and enclosed. Bedding might be drawn close. Windows might remain shut against cold air. Aromatic herbs or substances might be used to sweeten the room. Visitors, family, healers, priests, and neighbors could enter and leave, carrying news and perhaps infection. Without germ theory, isolation had different meanings. People might fear corrupted air, but they did not always separate the sick in ways modern medicine would advise. The household as a unit absorbed illness. When serious disease came, the weaknesses of medieval domestic air became more visible. Crowded rooms, poor ventilation, shared bedding, and close contact could help spread respiratory illnesses. Damp and smoke could worsen chronic conditions. Malnutrition and hard labor made bodies more vulnerable. Yet medieval people did not experience this as a laboratory of causes. They experienced it as seasons of cough, fever, loss, prayer, and practical care. They did what they believed and what they could. It is important not to treat all medieval health through one lens of horror. People survived, worked, raised children, built communities, and developed routines that made sense in their world. Many would have known periods of good health, laughter, rest, and contentment inside these same smoky houses. A room could be foul to us and familiar to them. A hearth could irritate and comfort at once. The human body is adaptable, and the human mind can attach love to difficult places. That is perhaps the most emotionally subtle part of this history. We can recognize that medieval homes often had poor air by modern standards, and still understand that people loved them. A cottage with smoky rafters might be the place where a child felt safest. A crowded room might be where stories were told, songs were remembered, tools were taught, and winter was endured. Comfort is not only physical, it is also relational. The air might be bad, but the household might be beloved. Still, the material facts pressed on everyone. The body could not be argued out of smoke forever. Chronic exposure to indoor smoke likely affected many lives, especially among those who spent long hours near the hearth. Eyes, lungs, and throats bore the cost. The elderly, infants, and the sick were especially vulnerable. But because such discomfort was widespread and ordinary, it may not always have been seen as an avoidable condition. It was simply woven into life. This brings us to another quiet question. What did medieval people consider a good-smelling home? The answer varied, but we can infer something from the efforts made to freshen, sweeten, and order domestic spaces. Clean rushes, herbs, flowers, fresh linen, aired bedding, swept floors, well-kept animals, properly stored food, and a managed hearth all mattered. A home did not need to be modern to be cared for. Care appeared in repeated labor, removing ashes, scraping dirt, repairing leaks, clearing scraps, keeping food from rot, managing latrines or waste pits, drying damp textiles, and keeping the fire under control. The problem was that care had limits. A poor household could work hard and still live with smoke. A careful family could still have damp walls. A tidy room could still smell of animals because animals were necessary. A well-managed hearth could still smoke when the wind turned. Cleanliness in the medieval home was not a simple moral achievement. It was partly environmental and economic. Poverty made bad air harder to escape. The design of the roof mattered greatly. In houses without proper chimneys, smoke holes or louvered vents could allow smoke to rise out. But the opening had to balance ventilation against rain, cold, birds, and heat loss. Thatched roofs could absorb smoke and soot. In some ways, smoke helped preserve thatch and discourage pests, yet it also meant the upper part of the house remained dark and pungent. Looking up inside such a home, one might see beams blackened into a record of years. The ceiling itself told the story of the air. As chimneys spread more widely, the night changed. A fireplace could draw smoke away, making sleep less smoky and rooms more habitable. But fireplaces also localized heat. Instead of a central hearth warming a common space, heat radiated from a wall. People gathered differently. Furniture could be arranged differently. Rooms could become more specialized. A house with several fireplaces allowed hierarchy. The best rooms warmed separately, the lesser rooms not. Air management became a marker of social order. The shift from central hearth to fireplace was not merely technical. It helped transform domestic life. The open central hearth gathered people around a shared core. The fireplace along a wall helped create directional rooms, chambers, and more divided living. Smoke control contributed to privacy. Privacy contributed to new ideas of comfort. Comfort contributed to new expectations. A change in air could slowly become a change in society. But for many, the old pattern persisted. At the lower end of the social scale, improvement was slow. Even when chimneys became more common, a poor chimney might smoke. A cheap repair might fail. Fuel might still be bad. Crowding might remain. The history of technology is never just invention. It is access. A solution exists only when people can afford it, build it, maintain it, and fit it into their way of life. Medieval sleep also followed patterns that differed from many modern schedules. In a world with limited artificial light, nights were long in winter. Some people may have experienced segmented sleep, waking in the middle of the night for prayer, quiet tasks, conversation, tending the fire, checking animals, or simply waiting in darkness before sleeping again. Whether or not every household followed such a pattern, we can be certain that medieval night was less dominated by artificial brightness. Darkness gave time a different texture. Waking in the night inside a smoky, enclosed house must have been a sensory experience. The room would be dim, perhaps lit only by embers. Shapes would be felt more than seen. The air might be colder than at bedtime. Someone might rise to stir ash, cover a child, or listen to an animal. In that hour, the difference between safety and discomfort narrowed. The house was dark and close, but beyond it lay a larger darkness. Cold lanes, fields, woods, weather, and whatever fears the night carried. So the closed, stale room may have felt protective in a way modern viewers need to work to understand. Fresh air is appealing when the outside is safe, lit, and easily controlled. But when the outside is freezing, muddy, dangerous, and unlit, a closed room becomes a boundary against disorder. Medieval domestic air was often poor because the alternative air was not always welcome. This does not mean people never sought nighttime air. In warmer seasons, openings might remain wider. People might sleep in lofts, barns, or other spaces. Laborers away from home might sleep in temporary shelters. Travelers slept in inns, halls, stables, or wherever safety could be found. Monks rose for night offices in cold, spacious buildings. The medieval night was diverse, but for the ordinary household in cold weather, enclosure was a practical form of security. If we listen carefully, we can hear how many medieval choices were about reducing risk rather than increasing comfort. Keep the door shut and you lose air but gain safety. Keep animals close and you lose cleanliness but protect wealth. Bank the fire and you accept smoke but preserve warmth. Share beds and you lose privacy but gain heat. Use small windows and you lose light but reduce cold. Again and again, the house answered danger by closing in. There is a humility in recognizing this. Modern comfort often rests on systems so dependable that we mistake them for natural conditions. Clean air, steady heat, artificial light, running water, washable bedding, separate rooms, insulated walls, safe streets, glass windows, waste removal, and medicine all stand behind the simple act of sleeping in a room. Medieval people did not lack intelligence because they lacked those systems. They lived before those systems existed in accessible form. And because they lived before them, they developed a different relationship with the senses. Smoke was not automatically assigned to evacuate. It was part of the hearth's mood. Damp was watched, endured, and managed. Smells were sorted according to source and danger. Cold air was not purely refreshing. It could threaten. Warm, stale air was not purely unhealthy. It could save. The medieval nose, skin, lungs, and habits belonged to a world of trade-offs. Late at night, the household's breathing might settle into a rhythm. Human breath, animal breath, ash-warm fire, cold wall, damp floor, heavy roof. A room could feel almost alive, holding the family in its imperfect shelter. The air might be thick, but it was shared. And shared air, in a world of household labor and danger, could be part of social closeness. To breathe the same room was to belong to the same fragile economy of warmth. Yet beyond the home, larger forces were already testing that fragile economy. Growing towns, changing building practices, shifting fuel supplies, and the pressures of disease would gradually force communities to think more carefully about where smoke went, where waste gathered, how houses were built, and how bodies lived together. The medieval night inside one smoky room was intimate, but it was also connected to law, labor, medicine, and urban survival. And when morning came, the same room that had held the household through the night had to be transformed again into a place of work. The embers had to be woken. The shutters had to be opened or kept closed, depending on weather. Bedding had to be folded, shaken, or pushed aside. Animals had to be fed. Ashes had to be managed. Water had to be fetched. The air of sleep gave way to the air of labor. This daily transformation is where the next layer of the story begins. Because the medieval home was not only breathed in while people rested. It was breathed in while they worked, cooked, cleaned, repaired, brewed, spun, nursed, aged, and waited out the weather. And in those daylight hours, the struggle for fresh air became not a background condition of sleep, but a constant companion to nearly every ordinary task of survival. The constant companion to nearly every ordinary task of survival was not dramatic enough to be recorded in most chronicles, yet it shaped the day more faithfully than almost any royal decree. It was there when the first person bent over the hearth to coax the embers back to flame. It was there when a pot was hung, when damp boots were set near the fire, when a child was washed, when ale was warmed, when wool was carded, when linen was mended, when a sick relative was turned gently in bed. The air of the medieval home did not simply surround life. It was worked into life. Morning began by disturbing the stillness. Ash that had settled overnight was moved. Embers were exposed. Fuel was added. The first smoke of the day could be some of the worst, especially if the fire was reluctant, the wood damp, or the wind unhelpful. Before the hearth drew properly, the room might fill with a low haze, and anyone close to it had to endure the stinging eyes and the instinctive turning of the face. This was not a rare accident. It was part of the routine skill of keeping a household alive. The person tending the fire knew the hearth almost as one knows a difficult animal. It needed feeding, but not too much. It needed air, but not the wrong gust. It needed dry fuel if dry fuel could be had. It needed patience. A careless fire wasted wood, filled the room with smoke, or threatened the roof. A weak fire failed to cook, warm, or dry. In that ordinary act of firekeeping, we can see a whole domestic technology. Practical, repetitive, learned by watching, and rarely praised. Cooking followed close behind. A medieval household's food could be simple, but simple did not mean effortless. Grain had to be ground or acquired as meal. Pottage had to simmer. Bread had to be prepared, even if baked in a communal oven. Vegetables, herbs, beans, peas, onions, leeks, and whatever meat or fish was available had to be cleaned, cut, boiled, roasted, salted, or preserved. Every step produced vapor, smell, scraps, heat, and smoke. The kitchen, whether it was a separate building in a great household or merely the central hearth in a poor cottage, was a factory of air. Steam from boiling pots added moisture to rooms already threatened by damp. Smoke from the fire darkened rafters and clung to clothing. Fat dripping near flame could produce sharp bursts of smell. Porridge, ale, milk, onions, old cheese, dried fish, salted meat, and fresh bread all carried their own presence. For modern viewers, the smell of cooking often suggests comfort because it arrives in homes where ventilation, refrigeration, plumbing, and separation of spaces are taken for granted. In a medieval interior, cooking smell was richer, heavier, and more permanent. It did not arrive and disappear, settled. Yet this heaviness was also the smell of nourishment. A pot over the fire meant food was being transformed into something edible and sustaining. A smoky room with steam on the air might be uncomfortable, but it could also mean the household had survived the night and was preparing for the day. This is one of the recurring tensions in this history. What was physically unpleasant could still be emotionally reassuring. Bad air did not always mean failure. Sometimes it meant life continuing. The daylight tasks of women were especially bound to these conditions, though we should remember that labor varied by region, class, marital status, and household economy. In many homes, women's work placed them near the hearth for long stretches. Cooking, heating water, brewing, washing, childcare, dairy work, textile preparation, and nursing the sick all brought the body into contact with smoke, steam, damp, and enclosed heat. A woman might step outside to fetch water or tend animals, then return to the low room where the fire waited. Her day moved between air and smoke, cold and warmth, yard and hearth. Brewing is a particularly revealing domestic activity because ale was not merely a luxury in much of medieval Europe. It could be part of daily diet, especially where water quality was uncertain or where weak ale provided calories and safer drink. In many places, women brewed for household use or small-scale sale. Brewing required water, grain, heat, vessels, fermentation, and storage. It filled the air with warm, yeasty, malty smells. It required boiling, which meant fuel and steam. It could be pleasant in one sense, but it also added humidity and heat to the domestic environment. Washing and laundering brought another kind of air. Heating water took fuel. Wet cloth was heavy. Drying it depended on weather, space, and season. In damp or cold months, wet garments and linens might have to be dried indoors, adding moisture to a room already struggling against condensation, smoke, and human breath. To dry cloth near a fire was practical, but also risky. Sparks could damage fabric. Smoke could scent what washing had just cleaned. A garment might emerge drier but still smelling of the hearth. Textile work also changed the air, though in quieter ways. Spinning, carding wool, combing fibers, weaving, and mending could fill rooms with dust, lint, and the smell of raw or worked materials. Wool carried the scent of sheep, lanolin, earth, and processing. Flax and linen had their own preparation. In many households, especially in winter, textile work occupied long hours indoors. It was productive, necessary, and often repetitive, exactly the kind of work that disappears from grand narratives while shaping the actual atmosphere of life. Consider a winter afternoon. Outside, fields may be too wet or frozen for certain tasks. The household gathers indoors. The fire burns steadily but not generously, because fuel must last. Pot simmers. Wool is worked. A child is watched. Tool is repaired. Someone coughs. Damp cloaks hang nearby. Light enters through a small opening or not at all, and the room depends on flame. The air thickens slowly, not from one dramatic event, but from accumulation. This was how discomfort often arrived, not as a catastrophe, but as the ordinary result of many necessary things happening in too little space. The home also functioned as storage, and storage had its own smells. Grain, herbs, onions, beans, apples, salted meat, smoked fish, cheese, ale, tools, leather, wool, firewood, baskets, and bedding all might be kept in or near domestic space. Storage was survival, especially through winter or poor harvests. But stored food could spoil. Rodents could enter. Damp could ruin grain. Strong-smelling foods could scent the room. A household had to manage not just the air it breathed, but the air around its future food. This is why dryness mattered so much. A dry loft, a raised shelf, a sealed chest, a smoke-cured beam, a thatch roof kept in repair. These were not minor comforts. They were defenses against rot, mold, insects, and hunger. Fresh air was useful when it helped dry and preserve. But uncontrolled air could bring damp, rain, frost, or pests. Ventilation had to be balanced against protection. The medieval house had to breathe, but not too much and not in the wrong weather. Cleaning the medieval home was therefore less like modern cleaning and more like environmental management. Ash had to be removed. Floors had to be swept. Rushes or straw had to be replaced or refreshed when possible. Food scraps had to be dealt with. Animals had to be mucked out if they were close by. Bedding had to be aired. Tools had to be kept from rust. Leaks had to be noticed. Smoke paths had to be understood. This was not a pristine world, but it was not necessarily a careless one. The labor of keeping a home livable was constant. The floor, especially in poorer rural houses, deserves careful attention. A beaten earth floor could be practical and inexpensive, but it was also vulnerable. In wet weather, it could hold damp. In dry weather, it could produce dust. It could absorb spills, odors, and the traces of animals or muddy feet. Covering it with rushes, straw, or other materials could make it warmer and more pleasant. But those coverings required renewal. If left too long, they became part of the problem rather than the solution. There is a long-standing popular image of medieval floors covered with filthy layers of rushes left for months or years. Like many vivid images, it can become exaggerated if repeated without care. Practices varied widely. Some households likely kept floors better than others. Wealthier spaces could be maintained more carefully. Poorer households might have fewer resources and less time. What matters most is not the cartoon of universal filth, but the reality that floor coverings were both useful and unstable. They warmed, absorbed, scented, concealed, and complicated the room. Fresh rushes could make a space feel improved. Herbs scattered among them could sweeten the smell. But any organic covering in a smoky, damp, crowded room would eventually gather dirt and life. This made renewal important. The rhythm of replacing, shaking, sweeping, and refreshing was part of domestic air management. A good-smelling room did not happen by accident. It required labor, and labor required time, strength, and materials. In towns, the floor of the home connected to the street in unavoidable ways. Mud came in on shoes. Straw from the street clung to clothing. Market smells entered through the doorway. Waste disposal could be near enough to matter. Even a household that cleaned diligently could not fully separate itself from its surroundings. The domestic threshold was busy and porous. Air, dirt, sound, and news all crossed it. The daily movement of children also shaped the indoor atmosphere. Medieval children were not sealed away in separate, carefully ventilated rooms. They lived among adult tasks. They played near hearths, under benches, in yards, by animals, and among tools. They breathed smoke from infancy. They learned early where not to touch, where not to stand, when to move aside, when a pot was dangerous, when sparks were flying, when animals were restless. Childhood in a medieval home involved sensory apprenticeship. The child learned the house through smell, heat, texture, and warning. For infants, the air could be especially consequential. A baby kept close to the fire was warmer, easier to watch, and more protected from cold. But closeness to smoke was harmful. A cradle or swaddled infant might spend hours in the central living space while cooking, heating, and work continued around them. The home did not pause its fumes for the vulnerable. Instead, care meant making the best arrangement within a shared environment. Older people faced another version of the same problem. Age makes cold harder to endure. A place near the hearth could be a kindness. Could also mean more smoke. An elderly person with a chronic cough might need warmth more than clean air, or might be harmed by the very warmth that protected them. Medieval households likely knew these tensions through experience, even if they lacked modern vocabulary. They saw who coughed, who shivered, who needed the fire, who could sleep farther from it. The sick room, when it existed as a separate concept, was still shaped by the household's limits. In many ordinary homes, illness unfolded in the common room or a nearby sleeping area. The sick person was kept warm, fed, watched, and perhaps treated with herbs, broths, prayers, bleeding, charms, or remedies according to local knowledge and medical advice. The air might be sweetened with plants or aromatics if available, but the same room could also contain cooking, family movement, smoke, and damp. Care and exposure were intertwined. This helps us understand why medieval people could be so attentive to smells without arriving at modern sanitation. Smell was one of the few immediate warnings available. A sour mattress, spoiled food, foul drainage, rotting rushes, a sick animal, or corrupted meat all announced themselves through the nose. People did not need microscopes to know that bad smells mattered. But knowing that something smelled bad did not always mean one had the power to remove its cause. Air also marked time in the household. Morning smoke differed from evening smoke. Baking day differed from washing day. Slaughtering season smelled different from Lent. Harvest brought plant dust, grain, and storage concerns. Winter brought damp wool and heavier smoke. Spring could bring the smell of open doors, wet earth, animals, and repairs. Summer could bring flies, heat, and the sharper smells of waste and food. The medieval calendar was not only seen in church feasts and agricultural work. It was breathed. A household's relationship with fuel changed across the year. Firewood had to be gathered, purchased, stored, dried, split, and rationed. Access to woodland was often controlled by custom, lordship, law, or local rights. The poor might rely on fallen branches, gleaned wood, peat, furs, straw, or other fuels. Fuel quality determined air quality. Good dry hardwood might burn more steadily and with less smoke than damp brush or peat. But fuel was not chosen simply by preference. It was chosen by availability. This takes us beyond the walls again. The smoky air in a cottage might be linked to forest management, land rights, population pressure, and local economy. If nearby woodland was scarce or controlled, the household's air suffered. If a family had to use inferior fuel, the hearth became more irritating. If weather ruined stored wood, the winter room became smokier. Fresh air, once more, was not merely architectural. It was ecological and social. In some regions, peat or turf fires shaped domestic smell for generations. Peat could produce a distinctive smoke, sometimes heavy, sometimes familiar, and even valued in later cultural memory. In areas where wood was scarce, peat was essential. The smoke entered textiles, rafters, food, and identity. What modern lungs might find harsh, local memory might associate with home. This is not because the smoke was harmless, but because human attachment does not always follow physical comfort. The same could be said of thatch. A thatched roof was practical, insulating, and made from available materials, but it also interacted with smoke. In a house without a proper chimney, smoke filtering upward could darken and dry internal surfaces. Some of it escaped slowly. Some remained. Thatch protected the household from weather while also shaping the way air moved. It could be warm, effective, and vulnerable all at once. Fire risk was ever present. Sparks were not abstractions. They were threats to the entire shelter. So much of medieval domestic life involved tending things that might become dangerous if neglected. Fire, animals, food, damp, waste, tools, children, candles, roofs, doors, and illness. Air moved among all of these. It carried warnings and consequences. The smell of smoke in the wrong place could mean danger. The smell of rot could mean food loss. The smell of damp could mean a leak. The smell of sickness could mean fear. The smell of baking could mean relief. The house communicated through the air. This is why a simple phrase like "without fresh air" only begins the story. The medieval household did not merely lack ventilation. It lived in a sensory environment where air was information, burden, comfort, and threat. People breathed what they produced, what they stored, what they feared, and what they could not afford to change. In a wealthier home, daylight work was distributed more widely. Servants might work in kitchens, bakehouses, laundries, stables, dairies, and workshops separate from the lordly chamber. This produced cleaner air for some by assigning dirtier air to others. The great household was therefore not free from smoke and smell. It was organized around moving them away from status. The kitchen could be intensely smoky and hot while a private chamber remained comparatively comfortable. The stable could reek while the hall smelled of rushes, food, wood smoke, and people. Comfort was arranged through hierarchy. Servants lived inside this arrangement physically. A kitchen servant breathed the kitchen's heat. A laundress worked in steam and damp. A groom breathed stable air. A scullion handled scraps, grease, ash, and dirty water. In elite homes, the refinement of upper spaces depended on labor in lower ones. The cleaner air of the privileged room was never independent. It was produced. This is a useful correction to the romantic image of castles and manors. They could be impressive, spacious, and better equipped than cottages, but they were also full of work. Fires burned in multiple places. Kitchens roared. Candles smoked. People crowded into halls for meals. Dogs lingered. Horses stood nearby. Rushes had to be managed. Waste had to be carried. A castle was not a clean stone fantasy. It was a working environment with zones of better and worse air. Monastic houses offer another revealing contrast. Monks and nuns lived under rules that ordered time, space, diet, washing, sleep, and labor. That order could improve some aspects of cleanliness and air. Cloisters opened to the sky. Infirmaries, kitchens, refectories, dormitories, and churches had distinct functions. Yet monasteries also required cooking, brewing, heating, candles, latrines, stables, workshops, and care for the sick. They were more regulated, not magically fresh. The search for orderly air was part of a larger spiritual and practical discipline. Hospitals, too, were shaped by air. Medieval hospitals were not hospitals in the modern technical sense alone. Many were charitable institutions for the poor, sick, elderly, pilgrims, or travelers. Ventilation, warmth, prayer, bedding, and cleanliness all mattered, but within the limits of the age. A ward could be a place of shelter and also a place of close bodies and shared illness. The belief that air influenced health made environment important, yet the tools to purify or circulate air remained limited. The connection between air and morality also deserves attention. Foulness was often associated not only with physical danger, but with disorder. A well-kept home, a sweet-smelling church, a clean linen cloth, or a properly maintained hall could suggest discipline, respectability, and care. Bad smells could imply poverty, negligence, corruption, or contamination. Yet this moral reading could be unfair, because many bad smells came from necessary labor or unavoidable poverty. Then, as now, society could confuse lack of resources with lack of virtue. This confusion mattered in towns, where regulations about waste and smell often reflected both practical concerns and social hierarchy. Noxious trades might be pushed to edges or waterways, but the workers remained necessary. A tanner's labor smelled foul, but without leather, the town lacked shoes, belts, harnesses, containers, and countless useful goods. A butcher's work produced waste, but meat had to be prepared somewhere. A fuller's work could be unpleasant, but cloth production was central to urban wealth. Bad air was frequently the smell of useful things being made. The home of a tradesperson might therefore hold a different kind of air from the home of a field laborer. A weaver's house could be full of fibers and loom sounds. A shoemaker's home might smell of leather, wax, and tools. A brewer's house might carry yeast and damp heat. A fishmonger's household might never fully escape the smell of fish. These were not merely odors. They were livelihoods. To breathe them was to breathe one's place in the economy. And here, the medieval home becomes almost impossible to separate from identity. The air told you what a household did, what it could afford, what animals it kept, what fuel it burned, what food it stored, and how many people lived there. Before written signs were common for everyone, before modern addresses and neat zoning, the senses located people in the social world. A street had a smell. A trade had a smell. Poverty had a smell. Wealth tried to mask or distance itself from smell. Scenting the air was one way to fight back. Herbs, flowers, strewn plants, incense, vinegar, and aromatic woods or resins could be used in different contexts to sweeten or protect. Some efforts were practical, others medical or symbolic. A household with access to pleasant herbs might use them to make a room more agreeable. A church used incense to transform sensory experience into sacred atmosphere. A sick room might be fumigated or scented according to belief. These practices show that people were not resigned to bad air. They sought to alter it using the materials they trusted. But scent was not the same as ventilation. A pleasant smell could overlay smoke or decay without removing it. Medieval people sometimes understood this and sometimes interpreted smell itself as part of the remedy. If foul air harmed, sweet air might help. The logic was coherent within the medical framework of the time, even when incomplete. And in a world where the nose was a primary instrument of environmental judgment, changing smell could feel like changing reality. The daylight home was full of such partial solutions. Open the shutter but lose heat. Burn herbs but spend resources. Move work outside but face weather. Dry clothes inside but add damp. Keep animals close but worsen smells. Build a chimney if one can afford it. Replace rushes if materials are available. Sweep air, scrub, mend, shift, endure. Domestic life was an endless set of small adjustments rather than a single solution. Perhaps the most striking thing is how much intelligence this required. The medieval household was not an accidental pile of habits. It was a managed environment under severe constraints. People balanced warmth, smoke, food, safety, labor, status, health, and weather every day. They did not always succeed. They suffered from conditions we would find intolerable. But their choices often had reasons, and those reasons deserve to be understood before they are judged. By midday, in many homes, the air might have changed again. The morning smoke could thin if the fire settled. The door might open with more confidence if the sun warmed the yard. Work might move outside when possible. Bedding might be aired. Animals might be let out. A breeze might pass briefly through the room, lifting the stale scent of night. For a few moments, the house could feel lighter. Then clouds might gather. Rain might begin. The door might close. Wet clothing might return. The fire might smoke again. The same cycle resumed because medieval freshness was rarely permanent. It came in intervals. A door opened, a breeze passed, a roof vent drew well, a dry day allowed bedding to air, a clean bundle of rushes was laid down, a batch of good fuel burned cleanly. These moments mattered because they were temporary, and as the afternoon deepened, work prepared the home for another evening. Food was set near the fire, tools were gathered, water was stored, animals were brought in or checked. Children returned. Smoke began rising more thickly from neighboring roofs. Across village and town, hundreds of small interiors shifted again from labor toward enclosure. The day's air, with all its movement, began to fold back into the night. But beyond these daily cycles, larger changes were beginning to press upon the medieval household. Population growth strained towns. Fuel demands affected landscapes. Urban authorities struggled with smoke, waste, and crowding. Builders experimented, adapted, and copied better forms. Medical thinkers continued to worry about corrupted air. And then, in the 14th century, one of the most terrifying events in European history would make the question of air feel not merely uncomfortable but deadly. Because when plague came, people did not yet know the modern biology of infection. They searched for causes in the world they could perceive. In smells, winds, stars, bodies, corruption, and the invisible quality of the air itself. And the same homes that had always held smoke, damp, and breath would suddenly be viewed with a new kind of fear, as households, streets, and whole towns wondered whether the air around them had become poisoned. As households, streets, and whole towns wondered whether the air around them had become poisoned, the ordinary atmosphere of medieval life took on a darker meaning. Smoke was no longer only smoke. A foul drain was no longer only an unpleasant neighborly problem. A crowded room was no longer only the usual compromise of warmth and shelter. In times of plague, the invisible became frightening, because people could see bodies failing before they could understand exactly what was passing between them. For medieval people, this fear did not emerge from nowhere. Long before the great pestilence of the 14th century, learned medicine had treated air as one of the key influences on health. Air could be wholesome or corrupted, could be too moist, too cold, too hot, too stagnant, too heavy with rot. Bad smells were not merely offensive. They seemed like evidence of danger. The idea that disease might come through corrupted air was not irrational in a world where sickness often did follow foul conditions, even if the explanation was incomplete. A room full of decay could indeed be dangerous. A crowded house could indeed spread illness. A town with waste in its streets could indeed be unhealthy. The theory was wrong in many specifics, but it was built from observations that felt convincing. So when plague arrived, many people searched the air for answers. They looked to winds, weather, strange smells, the alignment of planets, rotting matter, marshes, corpses, and the invisible corruption of the atmosphere. In some places, authorities ordered fires to be burned, streets to be cleaned, filth to be removed, or aromatic substances to be used. Individuals carried herbs, pomanders, vinegar-soaked cloths, or strong-smelling materials believed to protect them. The goal was to defend the body through the nose and lungs, to sweeten or correct the air before it entered to modern ears. Some of these measures may sound symbolic, but they were not mere decoration. They made sense within a worldview where smell was a sign of air's moral and physical condition. If foul air could harm, then sweetened air might help. If stagnation was dangerous, then movement might matter. If corruption came from rotting matter, then cleansing streets or removing waste seemed reasonable. And in some practical ways, such efforts could improve urban conditions, even when they could not stop plague. The medieval home became part of this wider anxiety. In ordinary times, a smoky room might be accepted as normal. During epidemic fear, any enclosed and heavy air could feel suspect. A sick person in the household altered the meaning of the room. Their breath, bedding, sweat, and waste became frightening. The familiar closeness of family could become a channel of dread. The same bed that represented warmth and care could become a site of exposure. The same room that protected against cold could feel like a trap. Yet leaving was not simple. Flight was possible mainly for those with means, options, and somewhere else to go. Wealthier people might retreat to country estates, assuming the air outside the city was safer. Town dwellers, servants, laborers, the poor, and the obligated often could not escape so easily. A peasant could not simply abandon land, animals, and household. A craftsman could not easily leave tools, shop, and debts. A servant could not always choose departure. The air of plague was therefore also the air of inequality. Some could seek cleaner places. Others had to breathe what history gave them. The house of the sick demanded care. Someone had to bring water. Someone had to change bedding if possible. Someone had to feed, wash, comfort, pray, or call for help. This meant that the air around illness was not just feared. It was entered out of duty. Medieval households were bound by obligations that did not disappear when danger entered. Parents cared for children. Children watched parents weaken. Neighbors sometimes helped, sometimes fled. Priests entered rooms where others feared to go. The emotional life of bad air was complicated by love, responsibility, terror, and faith. In such moments, the domestic interior became almost unbearably intimate. A person with fever lay beneath covers in a room already thick with smoke or damp. Candles or lamps burned. Herbs might be placed nearby. Prayers might be spoken. The door might be opened for a visitor, then closed again against the weather or fear. If the sick person died, the house had to hold death as well as life. The air that had carried cooking, sleeping, and work now carried mourning. Medieval people often understood death and disease through a spiritual framework as well as a physical one. Illness might be linked to sin, divine judgment, fate, astrology, imbalance, corruption, or contagion in a loose practical sense. These explanations could coexist. A person might pray, burn herbs, clean a room, avoid foul smells, consult a physician, and still accept that God's will was ultimately beyond control. The world was not divided neatly into religion and medicine. Both entered the room. This matters because it affects how people responded to bad air. They did not merely ask how to ventilate. They asked what kind of disorder the air represented. Was it natural corruption, divine warning, urban filth, dangerous vapors, a sign of bodily imbalance? The smell of a room could provoke practical cleaning and spiritual fear at the same time. To sweeten the air could be both health measure and moral act. The plague also forced communities to confront how close life had become. Dense housing, shared wells, crowded markets, parish gatherings, inns, workshops, and family rooms had always made towns vibrant. They also made them vulnerable. The same urban closeness that allowed trade, craft, worship, and community now seemed to carry danger through invisible pathways. Fresh air became part of the dream of escape. Open fields, country breezes, distance from corrupted streets. But even the countryside was not untouched. Disease traveled with people, animals, goods, fleas, rats, and fear. Inside towns, authorities struggled to impose order on an atmosphere they could not see. Cleaning regulations, quarantine-like measures, restrictions on movement, burial rules, and attention to refuse all emerged in different forms across later medieval and early modern communities. These measures were uneven, shaped by local government, resources, and panic. But they reveal a growing recognition that the environment of the town could not be ignored. The air of one household belonged to the air of many. This recognition did not begin with plague, but plague sharpened it. The everyday nuisances of smoke, stink, and crowding were suddenly linked to survival. A foul lane was not merely unpleasant. It might seem dangerous. A heap of refuse was not merely unsightly. It might seem to poison the atmosphere. A crowded sickroom was not merely sad. It might threaten the whole household. Bad air became an object of public concern. And yet the ordinary fire still had to be lit. Even during fear, people cooked. They warmed themselves. They boiled water. They washed what they could. They cared for animals. They mended clothing. They kept the household going. The plague did not suspend the need for smoke. This is one of the more sobering contradictions. People feared corrupted air, but they still lived in houses where the basic technologies of survival produced smoke, steam, and closeness every day. The medieval response to plague, therefore, did not transform homes overnight. It added layers of caution, explanation, ritual, and dread to existing routines. A family might burn stronger-smelling herbs near the hearth. A town might order filth removed from streets. A wealthy household might leave for cleaner air. A physician might recommend avoiding foul smells or keeping the body balanced. But the cottage still had a low roof. The urban room still faced a narrow lane. The bed still had curtains to hold warmth. The poor still needed fuel. Over time, however, repeated encounters with disease contributed to longer changes in how communities thought about air, space, and cleanliness. Not in a simple straight line, and not with modern certainty, but through accumulation. Towns paid more attention to waste. Elite households became more invested in separated chambers and managed surroundings. Medical advice continued to emphasize air quality, season, and environment. Architecture slowly reflected the desire for better separation of functions. The fear of corrupted air joined the practical annoyance of smoke and the social desire for refinement. The aftermath of plague also changed the material world in ways that could affect homes. In many regions, population loss altered labor markets, land use, and settlement patterns. Some villages shrank or disappeared. Some survivors gained access to better wages, more land, or improved bargaining power, though outcomes varied widely. Where space opened and labor became more valuable, some households might gradually improve their living conditions. In other places, hardship, disruption, and recurring disease made life even more unstable. The air of the home did not change in one direction everywhere. Still, the 14th century marks a powerful turning point in the emotional history of air. After plague, the invisible could never feel quite the same. People had seen death move through communities with terrifying speed. They had seen households collapse, streets empty, bells toll, and bodies carried out. They had breathed the same air and wondered whether it carried fate. Even when life resumed, the memory of corrupted air lingered in medical thought, civic policy, and household caution. But plague was not the only force changing indoor air. Fireplaces, chimneys, urban regulation, and shifting ideas of domestic comfort continued to matter. In the later Middle Ages, the chimney became increasingly important in many regions, especially among those who could afford improvements. The spread was slow but significant. It did not simply remove smoke, it helped reorganize domestic space. A fireplace against the wall allowed rooms to be planned differently. It made upper floors more practical. It allowed heat in more private chambers. It reduced the need for a central open hearth in some contexts. It helped separate cooking from sleeping and receiving guests. In wealthier homes, this could contribute to the development of more specialized domestic interiors. Hall, chamber, kitchen, solar, service rooms, storage rooms. Air became more managed because life itself became more compartmentalized. The older Great Hall, especially in elite settings, had once been the center of much household life. Eating, gathering, receiving, sleeping for some members of the household, administration, and display. Over time, the highest status members increasingly withdrew into more private chambers. This shift had many causes, including changing social manners, wealth, architecture, and household organization. But smoke and comfort played their part. A private heated chamber with a fireplace offered a different quality of air and intimacy from a crowded hall. For those lower in status, the hall or shared room remained important. Servants, retainers, apprentices, and laborers continued to sleep, and work in spaces that were more crowded and less controlled. Once again, better air followed hierarchy. The Lord's chamber improved before the servant's sleeping place. The merchant's upstairs room improved before the apprentice's corner. The social map of the house could be read in temperature, smoke, and smell. Town houses also evolved. Some became taller, narrower, and more complex, with shops below and living quarters above. Chimneys, jettied upper floors, rear yards, privies, storage spaces, and specialized rooms all shaped the movement of air. A prosperous urban household might achieve a degree of separation impossible for the poor. Yet density remained a problem. A chimney could remove smoke from one room and send it into the shared urban sky, where it mingled with the smoke of others. A private improvement could become a public haze. This is another subtle reversal. The chimney improved indoor air by exporting smoke outdoors. But in a dense town, many chimneys meant a smoky skyline. The house became cleaner by making the street air thicker. The problem did not vanish. It moved. Medieval and later urban history is full of such transfers. Waste from house to lane, smoke from hearth to sky, foul trades from center to edge, discomfort from elite room to servant space. In villages, changes could be slower and more dependent on local conditions. Some rural houses developed chimneys and more divided plans. Others retained older forms for longer. Regional building traditions mattered enormously. A house in England differed from one in northern France, Italy, Germany, Scandinavia, or the Low Countries. Climate, material, wealth, law, and custom shaped everything. There was no single medieval home, and therefore no single medieval air. But the basic tensions remained. Heat, smoke, damp, animals, work, and ventilation. In warmer regions, the balance could differ. The problem might be less about winter enclosure and more about summer heat, urban smell, insects, dust, or the need for shade. Stone buildings could hold coolness, but also damp. Courtyards, shutters, arcades, and different window arrangements could shape airflow in ways distinct from northern cottages. Mediterranean domestic architecture often responded to sun and heat differently from northern homes responding to cold and rain. Yet everywhere, domestic air reflected environment and resources. This is why careful history resists one universal picture. A medieval peasant in a smoky English hall house, a Florentine artisan in a dense urban building, a Scandinavian farmer using different fuels and building forms, a French monastic community, and a wealthy merchant in a late medieval town did not all breathe the same domestic world, but they shared a pre-modern reality. Air was not mechanically controlled. It depended on weather, fire, building, labor, and social position. The absence of mechanical control made people attentive to subtle changes. Wind direction mattered. The dryness of wood mattered. The season mattered. The number of people in a room mattered. Whether a chimney drew properly mattered. Whether the door could be open mattered. Whether the household had enough fuel mattered. Comfort was not set by a thermostat. It was negotiated hour by hour. This negotiation gave medieval life a physical immediacy that modern interiors often soften. The house made the weather present. Rain altered the floor. Cold altered where people sat. Wind altered smoke. Sun altered work. Damp altered bedding. Frost altered water. Heat altered smell. The domestic interior was not separate from nature. It was a filter, sometimes a poor one, between the body and the elements. Modern people often imagine fresh air as something pure and outside. But for medieval households, the outside itself was full of work, animals, smoke, sewage, and weather. The house did not block a clean world. It negotiated with a mixed one. A breeze might refresh, chill, or foul the room depending on what it carried. The same open door could bring relief in spring, insects in summer, cold in winter, and smoke from a neighbor at any time. This helps explain why improvements in air were often gradual and practical rather than ideological. People did not suddenly decide that fresh air was good and smoke was bad. They already knew smoke was unpleasant. They already valued clean smells. They already feared foul air. What changed was the ability to build, afford, regulate, and expect better arrangements. The history is not a discovery of discomfort, but a long struggle to gain power over it. One of the most important forms of that power was separation. Separate the fire from the sleeping area. Separate animals from the family. Separate kitchen from chamber. Separate waste from water. Separate noxious trades from homes. Separate the sick when possible. Separate elite comfort from service labor. Each separation improved something, but often at a cost. It required space, money, materials, authority, or someone else's work. The medieval home began with compression because compression was efficient under scarcity. Later improvements often meant decompression. More rooms, more chimneys, more specialized spaces, more distance. But decompression was not evenly available. The poor remained compressed long after the wealthy began to spread out. This is one of the strongest hidden structures in the story. Fresh air, privacy, and comfort emerged together as forms of social privilege. And yet the poor also had forms of air the wealthy sometimes lacked. Rural households might have easier access to open fields, yard space, and seasonal outdoor work. A poor village cottage could be smoky inside but surrounded by wider outdoor air than a dense urban mansion. An urban elite chamber might be cleaner than a peasant cottage, but the street outside could be foul. No category is simple. Air followed not only rank but geography. The countryside offered its own problems. Manure, animals, marshes, stagnant water, smoky hearths, damp floors, and poor fuel could all shape rural air. But the possibility of stepping outside into fields or lanes, of airing bedding in open space, of moving some work outdoors, gave a different rhythm from urban density. In good weather, a rural home could empty into its surroundings. In bad weather, it closed back in. The seasonal opening and closing of the house was one of the central rhythms of medieval life. Spring repairs, summer ventilation, autumn storage, winter enclosure. The home breathed with the year. Thatch was repaired. Walls were patched. Fuel was stacked. Food was preserved. Bedding was aired when sun allowed. Animals shifted according to need. The house was not a fixed object but an ongoing project. A medieval person did not inhabit a finished environment. They maintained one constantly. A roof ignored would fail. A fire neglected would die or spread. A floor left unmanaged would worsen. Bedding not aired would sour. Food poorly stored would rot. Animals poorly kept would sicken. Waste left too close would foul the household. Fresh air came as the reward of vigilance when conditions permitted, not as a guaranteed feature of the building. This daily vigilance could become invisible because everyone expected it. The labor of maintaining breathable life was built into routine. It belonged to household knowledge rather than formal architecture. It was performed by hands, backs, eyes, and noses. It was remembered as habit. It rarely entered the written record unless something went wrong. When something did go wrong, however, the air could become part of complaint or law. Neighbors objected to smoke, stench, blocked lanes, dangerous fires, or trades that fouled water and air. Town records in various places reveal disputes over nuisances. These conflicts remind us that medieval people were not numb to bad air. They argued about it. They regulated it. They blamed each other for it. They knew when one household's practices harmed another. The shared nature of air made neighborliness important. A badly placed privy, A smoky oven, an overflowing drain, or a foul trade could affect more than one family. In dense towns, private domestic habits became public concerns. The air crossed property lines without permission. Medieval law and custom had to deal with that invisible trespass. This is one of the ways the history of air leads into the history of community. A house could not be understood alone. The smoke entered the lane. This waste entered shared space. The smells reached neighbors. Its fires endangered rows of buildings. The sickness could alarm a parish. To breathe in a medieval town was to participate in a collective environment, whether one wished to or not. After the plague years, that collective environment seemed more dangerous, but also more worthy of regulation. Communities did not yet have modern public health, but they had the beginnings of environmental responsibility. Clearing streets, managing waste, restricting certain activities, inspecting markets, controlling fires, and responding to epidemic fear. These measures were partial, inconsistent, and sometimes driven by misunderstanding, but they were real attempts to make shared air less threatening. The home remained the smallest unit of this larger problem. Each household could manage its hearth, bedding, animals, and waste, but only within the wider ecology of settlement. Fresh air was not just a window opening. It depended on the street outside, the neighbor's chimney, the town ditch, the market's waste, the location of trades, the weather, the season, and the law. A clean room in a foul neighborhood was difficult to sustain. And still, life went on with its strange mixture of hardship and normality. Children were born in smoky rooms. Couples married and built households under soot-darkened beams. Meals were shared in air thick with steam. Old people told stories by fires that made them cough. Apprentices learned trades in rooms full of dust and smell. Servants rose early to remake the environment for others. The house was never simply healthy or unhealthy, never simply safe or dangerous. It was the stage on which survival took its ordinary form. As later medieval society moved toward the early modern world, these domestic arrangements would keep changing. More chimneys, more glass, more urban regulation, more specialized rooms, more concern with civility and household order. But the older medieval relationship with air did not disappear quickly. Smoke, damp, crowding, and household labor remained central for many people long after elites began to enjoy improved spaces. The transition from smoky shelter to more breathable home was measured not in years, but in generations. And to follow that transition, we have to return to the building itself, to the hearth, the roof, the window, the wall, the chimney, and the small architectural choices that slowly changed how people breathed. Because the story of medieval fresh air is not only a story of plague and poverty. It is also the story of how ordinary structures learned, piece by piece, to guide smoke upward, admit light safely, separate heat from hazard, and turn the medieval house from a single smoky chamber into something more divided, more private, and more recognizably close to the homes that would come after it. To understand how ordinary structures slowly learn to guide smoke upward, admit light safely, and separate heat from hazard, we have to look again at the medieval house not as a failure, but as a living technology. It was built by hands that knew weather, timber, clay, stone, straw, smoke, and fire in ways that rarely appeared in learned books. Its improvements did not usually arrive as dramatic inventions. They came as small changes repeated across generations, copied from neighbor to neighbor, shaped by money, custom, and necessity. A roof hole became a more deliberate smoke vent. A hearth moved from the center of the floor toward a wall. A simple flue became a chimney. A single shared space became a hall and chamber. A cooking fire shifted into a separate kitchen where resources allowed it. A shuttered opening became a glazed window for the wealthy, then more widely available in later centuries. Each change altered the way air moved. Each change also altered how people lived with one another. The chimney deserves its quiet importance here. It was not merely a tube for smoke. It changed the emotional geography of the home. In an older hall with a central hearth, people gathered around a shared fire beneath a high, smoke-darkened roof. Heat, light, conversation, labor, and discomfort all radiated from the same core. When fireplaces and chimneys became more common, warmth could be placed in particular rooms. Smoke could be directed away from faces and rafters. Chambers could become more private. Sleeping, eating, cooking, working, and receiving guests could separate more clearly. Air management helped create domestic privacy. But this change was not evenly shared. For many ordinary people, especially the poor, the old smoky reality remained for a long time. A chimney required materials, skill, maintenance, and space. A badly built chimney could smoke almost as frustratingly as an open hearth. A fireplace could improve one room while leaving others cold. And fuel still mattered. Even a better flue could not make damp wood burn cleanly or make poverty disappear. The medieval house became more breathable unevenly, with wealth always moving ahead of need. Windows followed a similar pattern. To modernize, a window is one of the simplest ways a room breathes. But in the medieval home, windows were compromises. Large openings meant cold, rain, insecurity, and heat loss. Glass was precious for much of the period, especially outside elite or ecclesiastical buildings. Shutters could admit air, but they could also admit weather. Horn, cloth, lattice, or parchment might soften the problem, but none offered the clear, convenient control later generations would expect. The medieval room was often dim not because people disliked light, but because light came with costs. When glazed windows became more available in wealthier homes, they changed more than visibility. They allowed light without as much wind. They made rooms feel more enclosed and refined while still visually connected to the outside. They helped create a kind of comfort that was neither fully open nor fully dark. But glass did not automatically mean fresh air. A glazed window could make a chamber brighter while still enclosed. The desire for air, light, warmth, and safety had to be balanced differently in every season. Walls mattered too. Wattle and daub, timber, stone, clay, and thatch all breathed in their own ways. Medieval houses could be drafty and smoky at the same time because gaps did not necessarily create useful ventilation. A cold draft near the floor could chill feet while smoke still lingered above. A crack in the wall might let in wind without clearing the hearth. A leaky roof could admit damp without improving air. This is one of the details that overturns a modern assumption. A house can be poorly sealed and still poorly ventilated. Freshness requires not just holes, but movement in the right places. The best medieval builders and householders understood this practically. They watched how smoke moved. They knew which winds made a room worse. They adjusted shutters, repaired roofs, altered hearths, and arranged spaces according to repeated experience. Their knowledge was not written in diagrams of airflow, but in habit and craft. A good house was one that answered its place. The slope of the land, the direction of rain, the availability of fuel, the habits of animals, the needs of work, and the dangers of fire. Fire remained the central teacher. It revealed flaws immediately. A room that smoked badly punished everyone. A roof that trapped soot showed it over years. A chimney that drew well changed daily life. A hearth placed carelessly wasted heat or threatened disaster. Fire made architecture honest. Tested design every morning. As domestic space became more divided, comfort became more layered. The poorest might still live in one or two crowded rooms. A middling household might have a shop below and chambers above. A prosperous merchant might possess multiple heated rooms, glazed windows, storage areas, and a greater separation between work and rest. A noble household could use architecture, servants, and distance to move smoke, waste, animals, and hard labor away from high-status spaces. In each case, air marked rank as surely as clothing or tableware did. The cleaner room was often the room of privilege. That does not mean elite houses were fresh by modern standards. They could still be smoky, cold, damp, candle-scented, crowded with servants, and vulnerable to waste and disease. But they offered choice. A lord could withdraw from the hall. A lady might sleep in a chamber warmed by a fireplace. A guest might be received in a room arranged for display rather than labor. The poor had fewer such separations. They lived closer to the fire, closer to animals, closer to work, closer to each other, and closer to the street or yard. The air they breathed was less filtered by architecture and status. Yet the old medieval home also held a form of togetherness that later domestic comfort would gradually soften. In the smoky hall or cottage, life was shared because there was little room not to share it. People knew one another's coughs, movements, work rhythms, and habits. They slept near one another, cooked near one another, aged near one another, and endured seasons together. Privacy was limited, but belonging could be immediate. The same closeness that spread discomfort also carried warmth, care, memory, and protection. This is why the story of living without fresh air should not be reduced to misery. It was harsh, yes. It could damage lungs, sting eyes, deepen fatigue, and make illness worse. It could make winter nights heavy and summer streets foul. It could trap the smells of labor, animals, damp, and sickness inside the very place meant to protect the family. But it was also part of a world where home was not designed first for comfort. It was designed for survival, continuity, and work. The medieval household accepted forms of bad air because the alternatives were often worse. Cold, hunger, danger, theft, exposure, or the loss of valuable animals and fuel. Modern viewers often ask, quietly or openly, how people could bear it. The answer is partly that they had to, but it is also that they understood comfort differently. A smoky fire could be unpleasant and beloved. A crowded room could be stale and safe. A low doorway, a darkened beam, a rush-covered floor, a sleeping dog, a simmering pot, and a barred door could form a world that felt secure even when the air was poor. Home was not a clean atmosphere. Home was the fragile arrangement that kept people alive. And medieval people were not unaware of the problem. They smelled foulness. They feared corrupted air. They cleaned, aired, scented, regulated, complained, repaired, and improved. They developed customs around bedding, herbs, fires, windows, waste, and sickness. They built chimneys when they could. They separated kitchens when they had the means. They moved noxious trades when towns had the authority. They understood that air mattered, even if they explained its dangers through humors, miasma, divine order, season, or local experience rather than modern science. That may be the most trustworthy way to see them. Not as ignorant figures sitting passively in smoke, and not as romantic villagers untouched by discomfort, but as practical human beings working within limits. They lived in houses that breathed badly because the world around them made better breathing difficult. Their buildings were shaped by scarcity, climate, fuel, fear, wealth, law, and labor. Their air was the result of an entire society. By the later Middle Ages, the direction of change was visible, though incomplete. Homes with improved chimneys appeared more often. Rooms became more specialized. Urban authorities paid closer attention to smoke, waste, and dangerous trades. Wealthier interiors became more concerned with refinement, privacy, and controlled comfort. Medical and moral ideas continued to link foul air with danger and disorder. The medieval house was slowly moving toward a different domestic future. But that future was not sudden. For centuries, Many people still woke in rooms that smelled of smoke and damp. They still crouched near reluctant fires in the morning. They still chose between opening a shutter and losing warmth. They still dried clothes indoors, kept animals close, cooked where they slept, and breathed the residue of their own labor. The old trade-offs endured because the deeper systems endured. If we could stand for one evening inside an ordinary medieval home, we might notice the air before anything else. Not the furniture, not the clothing, not even the darkness, but the density of the room itself. The fire would pull our attention because it would be both beautiful and difficult. It would warm our hands while roughening the throat. It would light faces while darkening the roof. It would make food possible while reminding us that comfort had a cost. We might see someone adjust a pot. Someone else would shake out a cloth or bring in damp wood. A child would move toward the warmth and be called back from the sparks. An older person would sit close, eyes half closed, grateful for heat despite the smoke. Outside, the air might be colder, cleaner, or fouler depending on the season and street. Inside, the household would continue its quiet work of survival. And perhaps that is the strongest image to carry away. Not a dirty room frozen in stereotype, but a living room in motion. Smoke rising, people shifting, shutters opening and closing, fuel being saved, bedding being warmed, food being stretched, animals protected, children watched, illness endured, repairs planned. The air was never simply there. It was made and remade by the day. The medieval home was a shelter built from compromises. It gave warmth but trapped smoke. It gave safety but limited air. It protected animals but brought their smells close. It gathered family but spread breath and sickness. It preserved food but stored odors. Kept out weather but held damp. Every comfort carried a shadow, and every shadow had a reason. That is what makes this history more than a curiosity about smoky cottages. It reveals how deeply ordinary life depends on systems we rarely notice. Fresh air, in the modern sense, is not just an open window. It is fuel supply, building design, glass, chimneys, sanitation, medicine, wealth, law, labor, and public responsibility. It is the result of many historical changes layered together. Medieval people lived before most of those layers were secure. So when we imagine them in their low rooms, beneath dark beams and thatched roofs, we should do so with patience. Their homes were not built for our lungs. They were built for their winters, their fears, their tools, their animals, their food, their social order, and their understanding of the world. They breathed smoke not because they loved smoke, but because warmth came through flame. They endured stale rooms not because they failed to value air, but because fresh air could also mean cold, danger, damp, or loss. They lived inside contradictions because every human society does. And in the end, the medieval struggle for fresh air was also a struggle for control. Control over fire, over weather, over disease, over waste, over crowding, over poverty, and over the invisible boundary between the body and the world. The house stood at that boundary. It was imperfect, smoky, beloved, dangerous, and necessary. If there is a reflective question to leave with, it might be this: what part of medieval domestic life is hardest to imagine? The smoke itself, the lack of privacy, the closeness to animals, or the simple fact that comfort so often had to be traded for survival? And if you enjoy calm, thoughtful history like this, you're always welcome to stay with the channel for more quiet journeys into the everyday worlds that shaped human life. For now, we can leave the medieval household where it so often lived, gathered around the fire, breathing the difficult warmth of home, while smoke finds its slow way upward into the dark.